The sun hung low in the Arizona sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. The heat of the day still lingered, making the sand shimmer like tiny sparks of fire. James, a tall cowboy with a weathered hat pulled low over his eyes, rode slowly across the rough terrain. He had been traveling alone for days, following a winding trail that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Dust clung to his boots and the worn leather of his saddle, and he could feel every muscle in his body protesting against the harsh journey. But he pressed on. The desert was unforgiving, but James was no stranger to hardship. As he crested a small rise, he spotted something unusual against the backdrop of red rocks and dry shrubs. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of cloth caught on a bush, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a person, a young woman lying on the sand, motionless. Her long, dark hair scattered across the ground. She was dressed in simple clothing, the kind made from soft hides, but it was torn and dusty, and she looked exhausted. James slowed his horse and approached cautiously. He had learned in his years of travel that the desert could be deceptive. Some travelers were not friendly, and some came from tribes that did not welcome outsiders. He kept his hand near the revolver at his side, though he did not raise it. The woman stirred slightly, opening her eyes just enough to meet his gaze. "Do as you please," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if I go back, my tribe will punish me." James blinked, taken aback. Her words were strange and serious, and there was a look in her eyes that made him pause. She was afraid. That was clear, but there was more to it. A quiet determination that made him respect her immediately. "Hey there," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. The woman shook her head, wincing as a sharp pain ran across her side. She tried to get up, but her strength was clearly failing her. James dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry sand. He crouched beside her, trying not to startle her. "You need water," he said, "and a place to rest. Can you come with me?" She hesitated, looking past him toward the distant mountains. I cannot return yet," she said. Her voice was firm, but there was a hint of desperation. "If they find me, it will not end well." James nodded slowly, understanding more than she might have realized. He did not ask questions yet. The desert was a place for action, not interrogation. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen of water. "Drink this," he said. "You need it." She took it cautiously, her hands shaking, and sipped slowly. The water seemed to revive her, though the exhaustion in her eyes remained. James looked at her face, noticing the high cheekbones, the sharp eyes, and the skin sun-darkened from the desert sun. She was young, probably no older than 20, yet the hardships she had faced were written clearly across her features. "My name is James," he said after a moment of silence. "I'm a cowboy. I've been traveling alone for a long time. Can I help you get somewhere safe?" The woman studied him for a long time, as if trying to decide whether he could be trusted. Finally, she spoke. "I am Nayeli," she said. "I do not know if it is safe to travel with anyone. My tribe, they have rules. If I am gone, they will be angry." James nodded again. He sensed there was more to her story, but he knew that trust could not be forced. "I can help you. We can move slowly. Take rest whenever you need it. No one has to know. You can decide what to do next." Nayeli's eyes softened slightly, but she remained cautious. She pushed herself up with difficulty, leaning on James's arm for support. Every step was a struggle, and he could see the strain in her muscles. Yet there was something strong in her spirit. Something that refused to be broken, despite the hardships she had endured. They began moving together, carefully navigating the desert. James's horse walked steadily beside them, patient and sure-footed on the rocky ground. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the landscape. James tried to keep the conversation light at first, speaking of simple things, how long he had been traveling, the cattle he had once herded, and the people he had met along the way. Nayeli listened quietly, occasionally offering short answers, but her gaze remained alert, constantly scanning the horizon. The desert was alive with sounds that were easy to overlook. Birds called from distant cliffs, the wind whispered across the sand, and small animals rustled through the underbrush. But there was danger too: snakes, scorpions, and the ever-present threat of the scorching sun. James knew that traveling in the open like this was risky, but he also knew that staying put could be even worse. As night approached, they found a small canyon that offered some shelter from the wind. James helped Nayeli settle down on a blanket he had carried in his saddlebag. She was tired, and her movements were slow and deliberate. He made a small fire nearby, careful to keep it low so that it would not attract attention. Sitting by the fire, they ate what little food James had: dried meat and hard biscuits. Nayeli ate sparingly, still cautious, but the food seemed to give her a bit of energy. She watched the flames dance, her thoughts hidden behind a calm exterior. "Why did you leave your tribe?" James asked quietly, unsure if he was crossing a line. Nayeli did not answer immediately. She stared into the fire, then finally spoke in a low voice. "It is complicated. My people, they are proud and strong, but sometimes their rules are harsh. Leaving is not allowed. If I go back, I will face punishment. But staying away, I am not free either." James listened carefully. He did not try to offer advice or judgment. The desert had taught him that every person had their own battles, and sometimes the right thing to do was simply to stand by someone and help them survive. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, James and Nayeli sat in quiet companionship. The fire crackled softly, and the night air was cool against their skin. Despite the danger and uncertainty, there was a sense of calm between them, a fragile trust that had begun to form in the harshest of circumstances. James knew that their journey together was only beginning. The desert was vast, and the challenges ahead were many. But he also knew that Nayeli was strong, clever, and determined. And for the first time in many days, he felt that perhaps he had found someone who could teach him something new, not about survival, but about courage, choice, and the human spirit. As they drifted toward a restless sleep, James kept a watchful eye on the canyon. He thought about the words Nayeli had spoken earlier. "Do as you please, but if I go back, my tribe will punish me." There was a weight to them, a warning wrapped in determination, and he knew that understanding it would take more than words. It would take respect, patience, and time. The desert night was quiet, except for the occasional call of a distant owl or the whisper of the wind through the rocks. And in that quiet, two strangers, one a cowboy, the other an Apache woman, had begun a journey together. One that would test their endurance, their trust, and ultimately, their understanding of freedom. James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day in his bones. He knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, but he also knew that he was not alone. Nayeli was there, a symbol of strength and mystery, and together, they would face the trials of the desert, learning from each other in ways neither of them could yet imagine. For the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of hope, and in the eyes of Nayeli, he saw a spark of defiance, a courage that refused to be tamed, even in the face of danger. The desert stretched endlessly around them. But for now, they had each other. And that, James realized, was enough to face whatever came next. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, turning the horizon into a pale pink and gold canvas. James stirred awake first, the warmth of the fire from the previous night, long gone, replaced by the cool desert air that crept over the canyon walls. Nayeli was still asleep, her head resting on the folded blanket James had set beneath her. For a moment, He simply watched her, noticing the tension in her shoulders and the way her brow furrowed even in sleep. She had been through so much already, and yet there was an undeniable strength in her presence. James moved quietly, not wanting to wake her. He went to the horse, loosening the saddle and checking the water supply. The journey ahead would be long, and they would need every ounce of energy they could gather. The desert was no friend to the weak, and he had learned that many travelers did not make it through. But James was determined. Whatever lay ahead, he would help Nayeli survive. Nayeli stirred as the sun climbed higher. She opened her eyes slowly, glancing around the canyon. "We should move," she said quietly, her voice still rough from fatigue. She sat up with James's help, testing her strength before rising fully. James handed her the canteen. "Drink first. We'll need to keep our strength up for the day." Nayeli took a careful sip, then nodded. There was a quiet formality to her words, a reminder that though she trusted him more than the night before, caution still guided her every action. They set off again, moving carefully through the rocky terrain. The desert seemed almost alive, as if it were watching them. Small lizards darted across the sand. The wind shifted in patterns that whispered across the rocks, and the distant mountains rose like silent guardians. Nayeli walked close to James, leaning on him occasionally for support. He noticed her careful movements and the way she scanned the surroundings constantly, alert to dangers he might have overlooked. As the day went on, they faced the first real test of their journey. A sudden gust of wind kicked up sand, stinging their eyes and making it hard to see. James quickly lifted his hat and turned his face against the wind, keeping the horse between them and the worst of the sandstorm. Nayeli coughed, her hand covering her mouth and nose, and James realized how vulnerable she was. "Hold on to the horse," James instructed, moving to guide her behind the animal. The horse's calm presence seemed to offer some protection from the worst of the wind. Slowly, carefully, they made their way to a small rock formation that provided shelter. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving them exhausted but unharmed. Nayeli sat down, brushing sand from her clothes and hair. "The desert is not forgiving," she said quietly. Her voice carried a mix of awe and respect. "I have traveled through these lands before, but the wind is as dangerous as any enemy." James nodded. "You've survived worse, haven't you?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "Survival is never simple. There are choices that weigh on you, and sometimes the right choice is not the one that keeps you alive." James realized that her words carried more meaning than she let on. There was a life behind her eyes, full of experiences he could not imagine. And yet, despite the danger, despite the unknown, she had chosen to leave her tribe and face the world outside. They continued their journey, resting briefly under the shade of scattered rocks and sparse desert trees. James shared stories of his own travels, speaking of small towns he had passed, of cattle drives and dusty trails, of storms and river crossings. Nayeli listened quietly, sometimes asking questions about things she had never seen, like wooden wagons or distant towns. In return, she told fragments of her own life, of the tribe she had left, of ceremonies and songs, of the values and rules that had shaped her childhood. Through these exchanges, a bond began to form between them. It was subtle, often unspoken, but it was real. James found himself admiring her courage, and Nayeli slowly began to trust him more. Yet there was always a shadow behind her eyes, a reminder of the dangers that awaited her if she returned home. The second day brought new challenges. As they walked along a narrow canyon trail, James spotted fresh tracks in the sand horse tracks, moving quickly in the same direction they were heading. He signaled to Nayeli, and they crouched behind a large boulder to observe. "Hunters?" James whispered. Nayeli shook her head. "Not hunters," she said quietly. Men looking for those who leave their tribes. They will not ask questions. They take and punish. We must avoid them. James's heart tightened. The desert was already harsh, and now there were people actively seeking to harm them. He considered their options carefully. They could continue along the trail, risking an encounter, or they could divert into rougher terrain that would slow their progress but offer better cover. We'll go around, he decided. It will take longer, but it's safer. Nayeli nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. Thank you, she said. The desert can hide us, but people will always find what they look for. The detour was exhausting. They climbed rocky slopes, crossed narrow ridges, and forded small dry creeks. The sun was relentless, beating down on them with unforgiving heat. But together, they managed to push forward, helping each other over obstacles, sharing water and encouragement. By evening, they found a small cave tucked beneath a rock overhang. It offered some shelter and, for the first time in 2 days, a place where they could rest without fear of immediate danger. James started a small fire, keeping it low and controlled, while Nayeli tended to her tired muscles and scraped knees. I can see why you survive so well in these lands, James said, breaking the silence. You know the desert in ways I can't even imagine. Nayeli looked at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming. It teaches you, she said. It teaches you patience, caution, and respect. The desert is not your enemy, but it is never your friend either. They ate a modest meal, dried meat, bread, and some nuts James had carried. The firelight flickered across Nayeli's face, highlighting the determination in her eyes and the weariness of her journey. James realized that she was still holding back much of her story, likely for her own safety. But he did not press her. Trust, he knew, had to grow naturally. Night fell, and the desert sky became a breathtaking display of stars. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a silver ribbon, and the air was cool against their skin. James lay back on a blanket, staring up at the stars, and Nayeli joined him after a while, her back resting against the rock wall. For a long moment, they were silent, listening to the subtle sounds of the desert, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the rocks, and the quiet movements of nocturnal animals. You will stay with me for a while, won't you? James asked softly. Nayeli hesitated, then nodded. For now, she said, I do not know what comes next. I must be careful. But I trust you. For now, James smiled faintly, understanding that trust was fragile and earned through actions, not words. That's all I ask, he said. Over the next few days, they faced more challenges: scorching sun, sudden sandstorms, and treacherous terrain. Yet, with every obstacle, they learned more about each other. James discovered Nayeli's resourcefulness, how she could find water in unlikely places, how she read the tracks of animals, and how she moved with quiet precision across the desert. Nayeli learned James's patience, his strength, and his unwavering determination to help her survive. One afternoon, as they rested near a small oasis, Nayeli finally spoke more openly about her tribe. My people. They are proud. They have rules that must be followed. Leaving is seen as betrayal. Punishment is not always fair, but it is certain. I left because I could not stay, but I cannot forget them either. James listened, understanding that her journey was not only one of survival, but also of inner conflict. She had chosen freedom, yet freedom came at a price. He respected her courage, realizing that it took far more strength to face the unknown than to remain in familiar danger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they made camp for the night. The bond between them had grown stronger, built on shared hardships, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that each was watching over the other. The desert was still harsh, still dangerous. But together, they had begun to navigate it, and themselves in ways neither could have imagined alone. James knew that this journey was far from over. The desert stretched endlessly before them, filled with dangers both natural and human. But he also knew that with Naeli by his side, they had a chance not only to survive, but to learn from each other. And perhaps, in the process, they would discover something even more important than survival: trust, courage, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. As they lay under the stars that night, James felt a sense of calm. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. Naeli was there, a presence of strength and resilience, and together they would face whatever the desert had in store. And for the first time in many days, both of them allowed themselves to hope. The next morning, the desert seemed different. The air was still, almost heavy, and the sunlight cut sharply across the rocks and sand. James and Naeli rose early, moving with the quiet precision they had developed over the past days. Their journey had become a rhythm, a careful balance of walking, resting, and watching the terrain for dangers. Yet beneath the routine, an unspoken tension had begun to grow. The kind that comes when people know the choices ahead are not easy. Naeli moved a little slower than usual, her steps measured and careful. James noticed immediately. He had learned to read her expressions. The way her eyes darted to the horizon. The subtle tightening of her jaw. She was thinking, weighing the risks of the path ahead. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, keeping his voice low. Naeli hesitated before replying. "I am careful," she said finally. "There are choices I must consider. Some may save my life, and some may cost more than I am willing to bear." James understood that she was speaking of more than just the desert. Her words hinted at the inner struggle she carried between the safety of staying with him and the pull of her tribe, of a life she could not abandon completely. He said nothing, knowing that sometimes silence was the best way to show support. As they walked, they came upon a narrow canyon, the walls rising high on either side. The shadows were deep, and the temperature dropped sharply. James led the way, careful to watch the tracks in the sand. Naeli followed closely, alert and cautious. They had grown used to reading the subtle signs of the desert animal tracks, distant sounds, even the way the wind moved across the sand. Every step had to be measured, every decision deliberate. Suddenly, Naeli stopped. Her hand raised to signal caution. James froze, scanning the canyon ahead. There, in the shadows, he saw movement faint, almost imperceptible. Figures emerged slowly. Riding horses, their presence deliberate. Naeli's eyes darkened with worry. "They are looking for me," she whispered, her voice tense. "If they find me, I cannot explain. They will not listen. They will punish." James's hand instinctively went to his side, where his revolver rested. But he knew that fighting was not the first solution. They were outnumbered, and a direct confrontation could end disastrously. He scanned the canyon, looking for options, for cover, for a way to move without being seen. "We need to hide," he said quietly. "This canyon has small crevices and shadows. We can stay out of sight until they pass." Naeli nodded, guiding James to a narrow gap between two large rocks. They pressed themselves against the cool stone, hearts pounding as the riders passed. James could hear the soft crunch of hooves on sand, the low murmur of voices, and the distant sound of a whistle or call. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavier than the last. Finally, the riders moved on, disappearing into the canyon's twists and turns. James exhaled slowly, and Naeli allowed herself a brief moment of relief. "That was too close," she said softly. "Too close indeed." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're all right," he said. "But we have to be careful. They may be back, or there may be others. We need to keep moving, but slowly, and stay hidden whenever we can." They continued through the canyon, taking indirect paths to avoid the main trails. The desert was no longer just a landscape, they had become part of it, moving like shadows, listening, watching, and calculating each step. Nayeli's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. She knew where water could be found, where the shadows would give them cover, and even which plants could be eaten in emergencies. James admired her skill and resourcefulness. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, quiet, strong, and endlessly observant. As the sun reached its peak, they rested near a small spring, hidden among rocks. The water was clear and cold, a welcome relief from the relentless heat. Nayeli knelt at the edge, cupping water in her hands, and drank deeply. James watched her, sensing the conflict beneath her calm exterior. "You think I should return?" she said suddenly, not looking up. Her voice was almost a whisper, carried by the faint wind. "You think I should go back to them, face the punishment, and take my place among my people?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I cannot tell you what to do," he said honestly. "What you decide must be your choice. But I can tell you this: you are strong, and you have survived when many would have given up. Whatever you choose, it will be because you are brave enough to face the consequences." Nayeli looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. "It is not simple," she said. "If I return, they may forgive me, or they may not. If I stay, I will be free, but I will be alone in ways I cannot yet understand." James nodded. He understood more than she realized. The desert had taught him that freedom came with responsibility, that every choice carried consequences. He also knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience, and some decisions had to be made in the quiet of the heart. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden sound, the faint rustle of movement nearby. James stood quickly, scanning the terrain, and Nayeli instinctively reached for a small knife at her belt. It was a precaution, not for fighting, but for protection. They moved cautiously toward the noise, discovering a small group of travelers, a family traveling with a wagon. The family looked surprised to see them, but they were friendly. They offered some food and water, and James and Nayeli accepted, grateful for the brief respite. The family spoke of distant towns, news from settlements, and warnings about bounty hunters who roamed the desert in search of native people and fugitives. Nayeli listened intently, absorbing every detail. Each piece of information was a clue, a way to navigate the dangers ahead. That night, as they camped near the family's wagon, Nayeli spoke more openly about her tribe. "They are proud," she said, "but they are bound by rules older than any of us. Leaving is not allowed. If I return, I risk punishment. If I stay, I risk becoming someone I do not recognize." James listened, understanding the depth of her conflict. It was not simply a matter of survival. It was a matter of identity, of belonging, of choosing between two worlds. He felt a deep respect for her courage, walking away from everything familiar, yet not knowing if she could ever truly belong anywhere else. Over the next few days, they continued their journey, moving carefully through the desert, avoiding main trails and travelers who might report Nayeli's presence. They faced challenges, sudden storms that swept across the mesas, dangerous wildlife, and the constant threat of people seeking her. But with each obstacle, they grew stronger together. James relied on her knowledge, and she relied on his strength. Their trust in each other deepened, built on shared experiences and the understanding that they were each responsible for the other's survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand, Nayeli spoke again. "I think about my tribe constantly," she said quietly. "I wonder if they remember me, if they forgive me. And I wonder if I can forgive myself for leaving." James looked at her, seeing the conflict etched into her face. "You cannot know until you face it," he said softly. "But whatever happens, you will be strong enough to survive. You already have proven that. Nayeli nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming. I hope you are right, she said. The desert teaches many things, but it does not teach forgiveness. That is something we must find within ourselves. The night grew colder, and the desert sounds filled the air. The distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the rocks, and the quiet rustling of small animals. James and Nayeli sat close to the fire, reflecting on the journey so far. They had survived storms, threats, and the harsh landscape, yet the greatest challenge remained the choice that Nayeli had to make between returning to her tribe or continuing on a path of uncertain freedom. James realized that their bond had become more than survival. It was a connection built on trust, respect, and shared experience. They had become companions, watching over each other, learning from each other, and facing the unknown together. But he also knew that the coming days would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. As the fire crackled and the stars filled the sky, James and Nayeli prepared for sleep. The journey ahead would require courage, wisdom, and strength of heart. And while the desert was vast and dangerous, they had found in each other a source of support, a reason to keep moving forward despite the uncertainty. James thought of the words Nayeli had spoken when they first met. Do as you please, but if I go back, my tribe will punish me. He now understood the weight of those words. The fear, the duty, the courage, and the conflict they carried. And he knew that whatever decision Nayeli made, it would define not only her future, but also the story they were living together in the heart of the desert. For the first time in many days, James allowed himself to hope not for an easy path, but for strength, for courage, and for the possibility that they could face whatever came next with honor and resilience. And in Nayeli's quiet determination, he saw a spark that could not be dimmed by fear, by rules, or by the unforgiving desert itself. The desert morning arrived in silence, the sun climbing slowly over the horizon and painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. James stirred first, as he had every day, his body stiff but his mind alert. Nayeli remained quiet, her gaze distant, fixed on the mountains that rose in the distance. There was a tension in the air that neither spoke aloud. The journey had brought them closer, yet it had also brought the inevitable, the decision that Nayeli could no longer postpone. They moved carefully, their routine unchanged, walking, resting, and watching for danger. But today, the silence between them was heavier. James sensed that Nayeli's thoughts were far away, weighing the choices she had to make. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but he knew that words could not make her decision for her. Some paths could only be chosen in the quiet of one's heart. As they climbed a rocky ridge, Nayeli paused. She looked down at the trail they had crossed, the sand and stone etched with the marks of their journey. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in days, she spoke without hesitation. I have thought about my tribe every day since I left, she said, quietly. I have thought about the punishment I may face if I return, and I have thought about the life I may have if I stay. Neither choice is easy. James nodded. I understand, he said gently. And whatever you decide, I will respect it. You are strong enough to face your people, and you are strong enough to face the unknown. Nayeli's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning the horizon. Courage is needed, but courage is only part of the answer. There are consequences, and some cannot be avoided. The day stretched on, hot and dry, with the sun beating down on their backs. They found a small, shaded area near a rocky overhang and rested, sharing water and a simple meal. James watched Nayeli carefully, noticing the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands fidgeted with a piece of rope she carried. She was thinking, planning, preparing herself for what lay ahead. She was. "Do you regret leaving?" James asked after a while, breaking the silence. Nayeli looked at him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Regret is a heavy word," she said. "I do not regret my choice, because it was mine to make. But I do fear what may come if I return, and I fear what I may lose if I do not." James understood. Her words carried a truth that went beyond survival. Nayeli's journey was not only about moving through the desert, it was about navigating her identity, her loyalty, and her own sense of freedom. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they saw the first signs of a small settlement in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Nayeli's heart tightened. She knew that if she went further, she might find safety among strangers, but her tribe, her people, were not far behind in her thoughts. The weight of her choice pressed heavily upon her. James noticed her hesitation. "This could be a place to rest. Gather supplies," he said. "We can stay here a day, and you can decide what comes next." Nayeli nodded, but she did not speak. The settlement looked peaceful, but she knew that peace could not erase the responsibilities and dangers that awaited her. The desert had taught her many lessons about survival, patience, and courage, but it had not taught her how to escape the weight of duty. That night, they camped just outside the settlement, hidden among rocks. The fire burned low, and the stars spread across the sky like a blanket of silver. Nayeli stared into the flames, lost in thought, while James sat beside her in quiet support. "I think I know what I must do," Nayeli said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Returning to my tribe, it is dangerous, but it is also necessary. I cannot run forever. I cannot abandon the people who raised me, who shaped me into who I am. Even if they are angry, Takely Life 2000, even if they punish me, I must go back." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then, that is what you will do," he said. "And I will stand by you, as far as I can, until the moment comes. You are not alone in this." The next morning, they began the final stretch of their journey back toward Nayeli's people. The desert seemed quieter now, as if it understood the weight of her decision. Each step was deliberate, each movement cautious. Nayeli's eyes were alert, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. She was strong, determined, and yet a part of her still trembled at the uncertainty that lay ahead. As they neared the outskirts of her tribe's territory, Nayeli slowed, her hands gripping James's arm. "I must go alone from here," she said. "The people may not listen to anyone else. They will hear me. And only me, if I wish to be understood." James nodded, understanding the importance of her words. "I will go as far as I can with you," he said, "and then, the choice is yours alone." They continued together until the sun was high, and the familiar landmarks of her homeland appeared in the distance: rock formations, small streams, and the first signs of dwellings. Nayeli's heart raced with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she was walking toward potential punishment, but she also knew that returning was the only way to face her past and reclaim her place among her people. Finally, she stopped at the edge of the territory, turning to James. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude, "for everything. For helping me, protecting me, and trusting me. I could not have made it without you." James smiled faintly, though his heart felt heavy at the thought of letting her go. "You are stronger than you know," he said, "and I will remember this journey, and what you taught me, always." With a deep breath, Nayeli stepped forward, crossing the boundary into her people's land. James watched from a distance, his heart pounding as he waited for what would come. He could see the elders and others in the distance, noticing her arrival. Their expressions were a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and suspicion. Nayeli held her head high, her posture steady, her eyes calm but determined. She spoke clearly, recounting her journey, explaining her reasons and asking for understanding. The elders listened in silence, their faces unreadable. James watched, holding his breath, knowing that the moment could change everything. After a long, tense pause, one of the elders stepped forward. Nayeli's heart raced as he spoke. "You have risked much," he said slowly, "and you have shown courage and strength. Your path has been dangerous, and your choices have tested you. But we see your honesty, and we recognize your bravery. You will face the consequences of leaving, yes, but you will also be welcomed back as one of our own." Nayeli's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. The fear and uncertainty that had weighed on her for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of belonging and understanding. She had faced her greatest challenge, not the desert, not the dangers along the way, but the choice to confront her past and embrace her identity. James stepped forward slowly, keeping his distance, allowing her the space she needed with her people. Nayeli turned to him and smiled, a mixture of joy and sadness in her expression. "I could not have done this without you," she said softly. James nodded. "You did this yourself," he said. "I only helped you along the way. You have the courage to face whatever comes next." With a final nod, Nayeli turned fully to her tribe, beginning the process of reintegration, of rebuilding connections, and of accepting both the consequences and the understanding she had earned. James watched from a distance as she walked confidently toward her people, knowing that her journey, though ending in this chapter, had left an indelible mark on both of their lives. The desert stretched behind him, vast and quiet, a reminder of the journey they had shared. James mounted his horse, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and sadness. He had helped Nayeli survive, but more than that, he had witnessed her strength, courage, and resilience. The experience had changed him, teaching lessons about trust, honor, and the complexity of human choice. As he rode away, James looked back one last time. Nayeli was surrounded by her people now, talking, smiling, and slowly reclaiming her place among them. The sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm glow over the land, and James felt a deep sense of peace. Their paths had crossed in the harshest of places, and together they had faced trials, dangers, and uncertainty. But in the end, Nayeli's bravery had led her home, and James's guidance had helped her reach that point. The desert, with all its beauty and danger, had shaped their journey. But it had also revealed something greater: the strength of the human spirit, the power of choice, and the enduring value of trust and companionship. James rode on into the fading light, knowing that life would continue with its own challenges, but carrying with him the memory of a remarkable young woman who had faced fear and uncertainty and had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully herself. And in that knowledge, he found a quiet hope, a hope that courage, honesty, and respect could guide people through even the harshest deserts, both in the land and in the heart.